Hello, and welcome to Shakespeare in Context with Claire. Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream has so many elements which help us contextualise the play that I might not have time to cover them all. As promised in the last video, we will see how the marriage negotiations between Queen Elizabeth I and the Duc d'Alençon are lampooned by Shakespeare in his comedy plays. I will also show how Shakespeare observed nature. But first, let's start with some dates. A Midsummer Night's Dream was entered into the Stationers' Register by Thomas Fisher in 1600. It was published soon afterwards as A Midsummer Night's Dream, as it hath been sundry times publicly acted by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain his servants, written by William Shakespeare, imprinted at London by Richard Braddock for Thomas Fisher, and are to be sold at his shop at the sign of the White Hart in Fleet Street. A second quarto was also released in the same year by James Roberts. The first mention of the play by name was in Francis Mere's Palladis Tamia, or Wit's Treasury, in 1598. So, we know that the play must have been in existence by 1598, the latest. We can estimate the earliest dates based on contemporary news, although it's likely that any rewrites would have been brought up to date to reflect current events. In this case, an extreme weather event might give us a clue. In a series of published sermons, Dr. King refers to extreme weather in the year 1593 to 1594. Stowe mentions that in March 1594, strong winds caused oaks to overturn. Titania's argument with Oberon caused nature to be angry. And it wasn't just unusually wet and windy, it was also unusually cold. The summer of 1594 was the only summer on record since 1502 to be cold and wet, with extensive flooding across the whole of England. In Act 2, Scene 1, Titania gives a graphic description of the weather. Therefore the moon, the governess of floods, pale in her anger, washes all the air that rheumatic diseases do abound. And thorough this distemperature we see this season's alter. Hoary-headed frosts fall in the fresh lap of the crimson rose. Please press pause and take time to read this wonderfully descriptive passage. Shakespeare seems to draw inspiration from a number of literary sources, including Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Ovid's Metamorphoses, and Plutarch's Lives. Madeline Forey, in her paper, Bless thee, bottom, bless thee, thou art translated, Ovid, Golding, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, provides evidence that Shakespeare not only uses the Ovidian stories of Metamorphoses in the play, but he also parodies the excuses made by Golding in the preface to his translation. For example, the words brief and tedious used to describe the Rude Mechanical's play are also using Golding's preface. James McPeake, in his 1972 paper, The Psyche Myth and A Midsummer Night's Dream, draws many similarities between the story of Psyche and Cupid in The Golden Ass and the scene between Titania and Bottom. He also notes that Shakespeare seems to recall phrases from Adlington's apologetic preface to his translation of Appius' work, The Golden Ass, or The Metamorphoses of Appius, written in Latin, is about a man, Lucius, who tries to transform himself into a bird and ends up transforming himself into an ass. The protagonist in Aristophanes the Birds actually did change himself to a bird. This play, performed in Athens in 414 BC, has recently been recognised as an important source for Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. There are hints throughout the work that Shakespeare was influenced by Aristophanes. Two passages stand out in particular. Bottom wakes Titania with a song about birds, ending with a cuckoo. In Aristophanes the birds, Vistheritas, who has been transformed into a hoopoe bird, awakens Procne with a song where melodious strains roll forth in soft cadence and refreshing melodies, and pure notes rise to wake Phoebus, the sun god. An array of birds are summoned to sing, leading to the formation of Cloud Cuckoo Land. Titania, who is likened to Phoebe, the moon goddess, is awoken by the melodious song of a common man who has been transformed into an ass. She calls her fairies to wait on Bottom and sing him while he sleeps. The scene of Bottom singing a silly song about birds would have been comical on a very basic level to the groundlings, but it would have worked on a more cerebral level for the more educated classes who understood the satire. And now, in gay procession, moved at Zeus' lordly hall. For you, my feathered comrades, are invited one and all. To celebrate this happy day, come sovereignty, my treasure. Stretch out your hand and take my wing, and we will dance a measure, is the final line in the Birds. Oberon says to Titania when she wakes, "Sound music, come my queen, take hands with me, and rock the ground whereon these sleepers be. Now thou and I are in new amity, and will tomorrow midnight solemnly dance in Duke Theseus' house triumphantly, and bless it all to fair prosperity." Shakespeare, like Aristophanes, wrote popular comedies using satire, topical references, puns, and allusions to please and delight his audience. The earliest recorded performance was at court on 1st of January 1604 to 1605. Dudley Carleton writes, "On New Year's night we had a play of Robin Goodfellow." The play may have been an epithalamium, that is, one written for and performed as part of a wedding celebration. It is widely believed that the play was performed at a wedding attended by the Queen in 1594 to 1596, although there is no actual proof of this. A few possible weddings have been suggested. I will only mention those which took place after the harsh summer of 1594. There were 3 weddings in the mid-1590s where the Queen was in attendance, the brides being goddaughters. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, married the widow Dorothy Devereux, sister of the Earl of Essex, in late 1594. William Stanley, 6th Earl of Derby, married Elizabeth Vere, daughter of the 17th Earl of Oxford, on the 26th of January 1595. Lord Berkeley's son Thomas married Elizabeth Carey, granddaughter of the Queen's cousin, the Lord Chamberlain Henry Carey, on the 19th of February 1596. Although there is some disagreement on whether the play was written for a wedding celebration, most scholars seem to think that it was. The most likely candidate being the wedding of the Earl of Derby, whose mother became heir to the throne of Queen Elizabeth, and Elizabeth Vere, daughter of the highest-ranking Earl in England. The Earl of Derby was a playwright who is thought by some to be the true author of the works of Shakespeare. And the leading alternative candidate, poet and playwright Edward de Vere, was Elizabeth de Vere's father. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the character Hermia is refusing to marry her father's choice of husband and marry the man she loved. Both men are said to have equal status. Elizabeth de Vere was engaged to marry the Earl of Southampton, but the Earl of Southampton refused to marry her. We don't know how she felt about it. It might be that she didn't want to marry him either. She went on to make an equally good match, one that she seemed happy with, and unless the Earl of Southampton was the Queen's son, then the Earl of Derby was higher in the line of succession. The play is set in Athens. The link to Athens is reflected in the names of the characters. Theseus famously defeated the Minotaur and saved Athens from the evil king of Crete. He later took Hippolyta to Athens to marry her. Lysander, who claimed to be a descendant of Heracles, was a Spartan leader who conquered Athens. 100 years later, Demetrius liberated Athens from Cassandra and Ptolemy. Even though the play is set in Athens, there is no reference to Greece or Greek. It was during his travels in Italy Richard Paul Rowe happened upon a little place called Sabbioneta. This small walled city was designed and built under the supervision of Vespasiano Gonzaga in the 1500s. The place built here was a haven for scholars and intellectuals, and soon became known as Little Athens. There are other clues that it was this Athens that Shakespeare was referring to in the play. The main gate of Sabbioneta, or Little Athens, is called the Duke's Oak. The rude mechanicals agreed to meet at Duke's Oak to rehearse. There is a small church next to Gonzaga's mausoleum known as the Temple. Theseus proclaims that the lovers will be wed at the temple, and a few lines later Lysander says, "Bid us follow to the temple." Shakespeare draws attention to these proper nouns by capitalizing them both in quarto and in the first folio editions of the plays. The significance of this is lost in later versions when the capital T is replaced with a small t. Theseus does not have a Greek title, but the title of Duke, like the Duke Vespasiano Gonzaga, who built for himself a little Athens. The plot of The Birds by Aristophanes involves a man building a new city to rival that of the gods that was so popular men flocked to it. Vespasiano Gonzaga built himself an ideal city based on Renaissance principles that learned men flocked to. It has been widely recognized that Titania is an allegory for Queen Elizabeth I. The goddess Phoebe is a Greek Titaness goddess, hence the name Titania, equivalent to the Roman goddess Diana. Titania represents the sacred feminine, divine queen. There are many allusions to Queen Elizabeth I, the divine queen, as Diana in poetry and art. I will put a link below to David Shakespeare's presentation about the rainbow portrait, showing how Queen Elizabeth is represented as the goddess Diana and the sacred feminine. The moon is mentioned more in this play than any other Shakespeare play. The moon, methinks, looks with watery eye, and when she weeps, weeps every little flower, lamenting some enforced chastity. On the night that Queen Elizabeth I determined to marry, she was kept awake by the weeping of her maids in waiting. By the morning she had changed her mind. She never married, and she would never produce an heir. Though you will hear many scholars liken Titania to Queen Elizabeth, they don't seem to question who was her Nick Bottom. The evidence is that Bottom is an allegory for Hercule François Duc d'Alençon. As discussed in my last video, Twelfth Night, Queen Elizabeth was attracted to tall, elegant men, such as Christopher Hatton, and her lifelong love, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. The Duc d'Alençon, who was around 5 foot tall, had a face scarred from smallpox. He was described as an ugly little man. When the marriage negotiations began between him and the Queen around 1571, he was half her age. When he secretly came to England to meet her, despite his appearance, the Queen appeared to be enamoured by him. Elizabeth took care for Alençon's every comfort when he stayed at her court. She often visited him alone in his room. Although named Hercule at birth, he was later christened Francois, and as the younger brother to the King of France, he was known as Monsieur. My mistress with a monster is in love, or my mistress with a monsieur is in love. Notice that it is spelled Monsieur with a U before the N. This is how it was spelt in the first folio and in contemporary documents. I'm not sure whether this is an English variant of the word monsieur, or whether the pronunciation was particular to the king's brother. Elizabeth wrote a poem called On Monsieur's Departure. Although after the weeping and wailing of her ladies-in-waiting, she decided not to marry the Duc d'Alençon, she corresponded with him regularly until he died. She was genuinely upset at his death and went into mourning for 6 months. Bottom calls upon the fairies.
Monsieur Cobweb, good monsieur, and good monsieur, bring me the honey bag. Do not fret yourself too much in the action, monsieur, and good monsieur, have the care the honey bag break not. I would be loath to have you overflown with a honey bag.
Honey bags, money bags. Alençon asked the Queen for money. She provided him with £300,000 when he departed for military service in Holland in 1582. Bottom says, I could play Hercules, really. He drops the H, like the French or Belgian Hercule. I didn't learn about Hercules from a Disney film, but from a Ladybird book, which I still have. Hercules is the ultimate hero, but like Aristophanes, Shakespeare makes Hercules, or Hercule, the butt of the joke. Bottom attempts a Hercules quote.
The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far, and make and mar the foolish fates.
Here are the lines from Hercules' opening prologue in John Studley's 1571 translation of Seneca's Hercules Otaeus. Lord of ghosts, whose fiery flash that forth thy hand doth shake, doth cause the trembling lodge twain of Phoebus' car to quake. Hercules, in Greek plays, is often represented as a comical character, a buffoon, like Nick Bottom. Notice the nod to Phoebus, the sun god, who Aristophanes refers to regularly. As I already mentioned, Hercule Francois Duc d'Alençon's face was scarred from smallpox. There was concern that the Queen would not find him attractive. Mote Fenelon, pronounced mote but spelt moth, like Titania's fairy moth, which is spelt mote in some editions of the play. Mote Fenelon, who was the French ambassador involved at the start of the marriage negotiations, wrote to Ambassador Dales about the teenage Francois Duc d'Alençon that he had a beard coming, implying that this may hide some of the scars. Francis Flute, when asked by Peter Quince to play Thisbe the lady, Francis says,
Nay, let me not play a woman. I have a beard coming.
Quince replies,
Then you can play it in a mask.
It was the fashion in the French court during the Renaissance to wear masks. Quince might be named after de quincer. Snout could also be a play on beak or du bec, both members of the French delegation. Bottom asks, what beard should I play it in? I will distort it in either your straw-colour beard, your orange tawny beard, your purple and grain beard, or your French crown colour beard, your perfect yellow. Quinn says, some of your French crowns have no hair at all, and then you will play it barefaced. This small passage works on so many levels. Firstly, it describes Elizabeth's suitors, or love interests, all with different coloured beards. Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, was one-time favourite of Elizabeth. The Earls of Oxford had an orange tawny livery. The French crown refers to currency, but it also refers to royalty. Yellow is the bright colour of the French crown, but can also imply cowardice. Some of your French crowns have no hair at all. Heir, as in heir to the throne. The Duc d'Alençon was heir presumptive, as his elder brother Henry III had no children. He left Queen Elizabeth's court after failing to make a match and died childless at the age of 29. It may also be an allusion to syphilis, known as the French pox. One of the symptoms is hair loss. Bottom, a simple man, is trying to sound intelligent by using big words that he doesn't really understand. I wonder whether some of the malapropisms made by Bottom was another dig at the Duc d'Alençon. There would be no need for the Duc d'Alençon to learn English. Queen Elizabeth and her courtiers would have been fluent French speakers. The Duc d'Alençon was eager to please the Queen. I think it is quite likely that he tried to learn some English, but as a new learner got it wrong. Shakespeare has used inversion a few times in this play to comic effect. Is this another example? Bottom says, there we will rehearse most obscenely and courageously. Take pains to be perfect. Adieu. Obscene, courage, peine, parfait, and adieu are all French words. In fact, I think that all Bottom's malapropisms are words of French derivation. Perhaps you can leave a comment below if you find any that aren't. What does the context of this play tell us about Shakespeare? Let's start with the traditional attribution. Shakespeare of Stratford is thought to have left home and headed for London any time between 1585 and 1592. There has never been any suggestion that he started writing before coming to London. By 1595, the author Shakespeare had written one of his best plays, arguably his best comedy. It is a mature piece of work with many sources. If William left Stratford in 1585 at the earliest, would he have had time to develop his writing skills to produce a masterpiece 10 years later? Possibly. Some of the sources used for A Midsummer Night's Dream had not been translated to English by then. There is evidence that Shakespeare referred to the English translations from Ovid's Metamorphoses and The Golden Ass, but Aristophanes the Birds was not translated into English until later. William had no documented education. If he did attend grammar school, he would have learned Latin, but would he be fluent in Greek also? Because it was thought that Shakespeare knew little Greek, little work has been done to investigate Greek sources. But the author must have had quite a good grasp of Greek to be able to use the Greek sources as he did. He also shows a knowledge of the original Latin works, not just the translations. it is often stated that Shakespeare read Ovid's Metamorphoses in Stratford Grammar School. There was no national curriculum. No one knows what books were available at Stratford Grammar School. They may have had some works by Ovid, but the truth is, we don't know. The marriage negotiations between Duke d'Alençon and Queen Elizabeth were over by the time William of Stratford was 18 years old. However, they were public knowledge and would not have been forgotten in the mid-1590s. In fact, we still sing about it today with the song Froggy Went A-Courtin'. It is unlikely that he would have had the inside info. It's also worth mentioning that in 1579, a man called John Stubbs had his hand cut off for producing a seditious pamphlet about the marriage negotiations. Satirizing the marriage negotiations in a play would have been dangerous. Shakespeare includes details about a place called Little Athens in Italy. It's difficult to understand how this knowledge was obtained unless the author had been there. The similarities between the preface materials in Ovid and Adlington's translations about Metamorphoses are interesting. Both were published when 3-year-old William was growing up in Stratford, so would have been available by the time he was old enough to go to school. For the believers in the traditional story, I wish I could say there was more evidence that Will of Stratford wrote this play, but the only link that I could find is that he was a shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain's men, who had performed the play prior to publication. Does any of the evidence support the leading alternative candidate as the author of this play? Edward de Vere spent time in the court of Queen Elizabeth throughout the time of the marriage negotiations. In 1581, he was kept under arrest for at least 4 months after an affair with a lady-in-waiting. He had plenty of time to sit and write. In 1594, he was living a quiet life at his house, King's Place, possibly rewriting the play during a cold, stormy summer, in time for his eldest daughter's wedding. Before the age of 8, de Vere was brought up in the household of his tutor, the Greek scholar Thomas Smith. Later, he was a ward of court in the household of William Cecil. William's wife Mildred Cecil, who was said to have been able to speak Greek as fluently as English, was in charge of de Vere's education. There is documentary evidence of the Greek books and manuscripts owned by Thomas Smith and Mildred Cecil. Although available in continental Europe, none of the Greek source materials had been published in England at this time, so they were not in general circulation. Edward de Vere went to France just before the coronation and marriage of Henry III of France, where he would have met the Duke d'Alençon. He was later involved with the marriage negotiations between the Duke and Queen Elizabeth. Vere also hosted French ambassadors and arranged some of the entertainments for them. Edward de Vere visited Florence and Milan. Although there is no documentary evidence that he visited Sabbioneta, it lies halfway between the two cities. Sabbioneta, or Little Athens, attracted intellectuals and Renaissance thinkers like the Earl of Oxford, who would have received a warm welcome there, as it is reported that he did throughout Italy. It would have been seen as a status symbol to host such a high-ranking earl from Elizabeth's court. He was also renowned for being generous, funny, and extremely learned. It is documented that on his travels in Europe, he sought out to meet great Renaissance thinkers. Ovid's Metamorphoses was translated at the time. De Vere, ward of the Cecils, and his uncle Arthur Golding were living at Cecil House. Golding's translation of Ovid is quite different to his other translations. It is more likely to be the work of a talented teenager than the work of a puritanical scholar, who generally published religious commentaries. The poetic nature and style of the work is much more akin to a young Shakespeare. The translation of the Golden Ass was completed just before the 16-year-old Earl accompanied the Queen on her progress to Oxford in 1566, where he was awarded a master's degree. It has been suggested that both these translations are the work of Edward de Vere, published under an anonym. It is interesting that the preface to these works shows similarities. They provide a thorough explanation of the work, dedicatees, when none is needed, like Bottom explaining Pyramus and Thisbe to his educated audience. In a discussion group, one of my contacts suggested that the master's degree might have been awarded for the translation work. The explanatory preface might make it was an introduction to a work to be presented as a thesis for a master's degree. This is speculation. If you read the preface, you can imagine that it had been written by a teenager who feels that he has produced a great piece of work, but is insecure about how it will be received. Not much is known of William Adlington. He has left very little trace, apart from this one great work. There may be a clue to the author's identity in the name on the title page. Renowned literary critic Harold Bloom declares the play Shakespeare's first undoubted masterwork, without flaw, and one of his dozen or so plays of overwhelming originality and power. Whereas Twelfth Night seemed to be a bit disjointed, Midsummer seems totally resolved, with all the disparate parts woven together to create the whole. I've had so many aha moments researching this play, and because there are so many cross-links, it has been difficult to put things under separate headings. I get the feeling that this was one of Shakespeare's favourite plays. It is a finished masterpiece, published in his lifetime. Like Twelfth Night, it lampoons court life in the late 1570s and early 1580s. It was probably written and presented at the time, and then rewritten for the marriage celebrations of the mid-1590s. In this play, Shakespeare pokes gentle fun at his characters. It was published when all had been forgotten and mended, no more yielding but a dream. Over a decade earlier, Elizabeth wrote in the last line of her poem on Monsieur's departure, "Or let me love with some more sweet content, or die, and so forget what love e'er meant." As I thought at the outset, there is so much to discuss about this play, it would not be possible to do in one hit. In part 2, I will be discussing flowers and love potions, and the geology and geography of Shakespeare. I will put a list of my sources in the comments section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If it has made you think about who really wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream, please go to doubtaboutwill.org to find out more. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment below. And remember, please be kind.